Greetings, everyone. I want to start by thanking the Ministry of National Security and the Jamaica Defence Force for inviting me to participate in this symposium on resilient policies for national development. And I especially welcome the invitation to offer some remarks on the topic of cyberspace innovation, particularly from the perspective of business. So the idea of resilience, for me, resilience is really about one's capacity and ability to respond to or deal with uncertainty. In business terms, we like to speak of risk, but to deal with uncertainty and the ability to recover from adversity. So that's sort of the characterization of resilience that I want to use to frame my comments. In this current context, COVID-19 is as big an adversity as any of us have experienced, I think, in our lifetimes. Certainly in terms of its the extent of its global impact. I think the last time I checked, infection rates were at about 10 million, and mortality outcomes were just about 500,000. So that's significant in terms of its health impact. Perhaps more so is the fact that it has shut down global supply chains. Economies have grown to a halt. Job markets have been significantly eroded. And even though Jamaica and the Caribbean have, relatively speaking, been perhaps more moderately affected than some of our more well-to-do neighbors, nevertheless, the effect on our economies has been devastating. For example, tourism, which is the mainstay of many Caribbean economies, has pretty much collapsed to close to zero. And the hyper-openness of economies like Jamaica in terms of our connectivity to and our dependency on the global economy means that the ripple effects are quite significant. COVID-19 has forced the curtailment of the traditional social and business practices and behaviors that we've been used to for the past perhaps century. So physical movement and interactions are now severely constrained by the new rules of social distancing and directives to tan your yard. Which means that the traditional workplace where people physically congregate, where people work in adjacent cubicles, they shake hands, they breathe the same recycled conditioned air, they use the same coffee machines, all of a sudden that workplace, that traditional workspace have become highly contagious centers of infection. And we don't have to speak to some of the examples we've had both here in our own context and elsewhere to see significant evidence of that. So what this has done is that it has amplified, in fact it has accelerated the urgency of cyberspace innovation. Now when we use the term cyberspace, we typically speak to this sort of virtual, interconnected space created by the internet. It's unbounded by distance, it's unbounded by geography or other physical constraints. In other words, we're simply talking about the digital world. For the purposes of the remainder of my remarks, and because my specific emphasis is on a business perspective, I prefer to use the term digital transformation. And from here on, speak about cyberspace innovation imperative for businesses as the urgency of digital transformation. So let's be clear, we are already in a digital economy. All that COVID-19 has served to do is to amplify and accelerate the urgency of our responses to that reality. Some people like to refer to this as the fourth industrial revolution, to distinguish it from, distinguish where we are now from the previous industrial paradigmic shifts. So you would have had the first industrial revolution where the emphasis was on the scaling effects of the steam engine and water and mechanical production. The second industrial revolution emphasized the division of labor and mass production and the effects of electricity as a driver of industry. So those would have been from the mid-1700s for the first, just shy of the turn of the 1900s for the second. Around about early 1970s, we would have seen the third industrial revolution, the emphasis and the impact of electronics and information technology and automation of production. But the fourth industrial revolution, which people signal as being imminent, puts a lot of emphasis on cyber physical systems and the combination of the biological with the digital. It's a nice concept. Sometimes it feels a little esoteric and can sometimes leave our businesses and our executives under the illusion that this is something that is down the road, that's not quite here yet, that we can give ourselves time to prepare for. But there can be no illusion that we are in the digital economy. So I prefer to speak about the emergence of the digital economy and the urgency of our response to that. And again, let me emphasize, while a lot of the conversations that we're currently having are prompted by the effects of COVID, that really just serves to underscore the urgency. But we're already in the digital economy. What do we mean by that? So it simply means that digital has become the dominant mode of interaction for almost everything that we do, for commercial interaction, for social interaction, and economic activity. So hence the digital economy is the dominant mode of interaction. One of the sort of either implications or perhaps drivers of that is data, and the fact that data has become sort of the new currency. We speak about it as the oil that fuels the digital economy. So in this environment, digital capabilities, organizations developing digital capabilities has become essential. And digital capabilities becomes the enabler of what we refer to as business agility. What do I mean by agility? The ability to sense and respond to opportunities and threats in a very volatile environment. Now, I want to emphasize business agility because it is, in fact, one of the critical dimensions of resilience. So, when we look at the definitions of resilience, it speaks about anticipating uncertainty, being prepared, and then being able to respond in the advent of adversity. I'd like to suggest that business agility, the ability to respond, to both sense and respond to threats, is perhaps the biggest component of resilience, right? Because increasingly the environment in which we exist is so volatile. And I mean, who could anticipate something like COVID-19? I mean, persons would argue that organizations have a responsibility and an imperative to be prepared for the next pandemic. But it would have been very difficult to anticipate the effects that COVID has had. And so what becomes more important to agility is an organization's ability to respond. And I'd suggest that agility is a big part of that capacity to respond. A few more comments I would want to make on the digital economy. So what we're going to talk about now is the urgency of organizations building their digital capabilities in an effort to be able to compete well in the digital economy and respond to the uncertainties and the adversities that invariably accompany a much more volatile environment. So, a few observations about the digital economy, and this is drawn from a quite interesting video which perhaps I'll provide a link to in the notes that accompany this talk. So first of all, 50% of today's consumers are digital natives. Born after 1990, grew up in a digital environment, and so they're preferences, their behaviors are shaped by being in a digital economy. Second observation that is quite interesting. If we sort of modify the notion of what we mean by a country to being a governed community, then China is only the 5th largest governed community in the world. So social communities like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp are larger governed constituencies than countries. And that's quite important, because we're talking about governance influences that are quite different. You can talk about the undue influence that social media exerts on our politics. And then who sets the rules for that influence? Is it Mark Zuckerberg? So does he exercise perhaps undue influence on how we behave as societies and communities? So it's quite interesting to think about. The third sort of characteristic that I would point to in terms of the digital economy is the fact that social media has now become a far greater influencer in people's awareness, in the information they consume, and their purchasing decisions than any other form of media or communication channels. And again, that's quite important. 10 years ago, we just thought of social media as something to go play in when you're kind of want to socialize a bit. It has now become the dominant influencer of what people think, the information they consume. A third point is that people's attention span and communications bandwidth is there's a suggestion that it's less than that of the goldfish. That's an interesting observation. But the point is that our attention to keep people's attention means that we have to be quite creative in the way we use these new media. The other point to be made about the digital economy is that it's not just about, and responding to the challenges of the digital economy, it's not just about access to the internet and connectivity. There are a set of disruptive technologies that organizations have to begin to embrace. Cloud computing, mobile computing. Again, we need to think of these as not just technologies, but as drivers of business agility. Cloud gives businesses the ability to scale up rapidly and respond to opportunities. We also have to think of mobile computing as not just an additional channel of engagement, which it is, but it's not simply that. But we have to think of it in terms of this important construct that I like to call mobility. The ability that we can reach consumers, we can reach customers, wherever they are, whenever they are. And so the essence of mobility is a quite important characteristic of that channel. In the digital economy, we have to think about other disruptive technologies, such as big data and big data analytics. We have to think about advanced analytics and artificial intelligence. And as I mentioned, the disruptive effects of social media. Social media has become the dominant channel of engagement, of information, of interaction, and with our customers and our consumers and our constituents. And that's where public sentiment, that's where opinions and consensus are shaped and enhanced. And as businesses, we ignore that at our peril. So, as we think about our organizational responses, the imperative of digital transformation and responding to these enablers of the digital technology, organizations need to look beyond just the technologies themselves, but how does it transform my business? And again, I come back to the word agility. Agility is a quite important attribute of business. Not only agility in the way we do projects in an iterative, incremental, and participatory way, but agility in the way we frame our human resource organizations in flexi work and allowing our employees to work where they want to and when they want to. the kind of workplace that attracts millennials and digital natives, the kind of workplace that embraces things like self-service. But perhaps most importantly, agility is about leadership. And again, the ability of executives and executive leaders to be prepared to make their business models dynamic, adaptive, to be entrepreneurial, to have strategic foresight and insight that allows you to respond to not only things as they happen, but to anticipate things that might be coming down the road. So those are the kinds of, I think, business shifts that are a critical part of digital transformation. And again, the underlying technologies that I've mentioned, cloud, mobile, social, big data, are enablers. They're critical enablers. But at the end of the day, this is about executive leadership, and digital transformation is a strategic leadership imperative. Okay, so we've established that digital transformation is a strategic imperative for organizations if they are to innovate to this in this new normal, and it is an imperative for organizational leadership. Over the course of the past year, we've worked with a number of organizations to try and understand the extent to which executive leadership is preparing itself to respond to this challenge, this new imperative, this digital transformational urgency. And so one of the questions we asked, just imagine an ideal organization in your own industry, whether it's banking, whether it's retail, whether it's insurance or even education. Imagine an ideal organization that has undergone digital transformation to improve their processes, to engage talent, and to drive new value-generating business models. Now, imagine that organization and then assess how close your organization is to that ideal. So on a scale of 1, being nowhere, not at all, to 10, that you think that your organization is fully embracing that. And the responses to that were quite interesting. Many executive leaders, and again, this is a conversation that was taking place before the COVID-19 crisis. Many executive leaders assessed that their organizations were somewhere between 1 and 3, so very early stage, recognizing that digital transformation is urgent, and many of them suggest that in 3 years they're going to be seeing digital competitors that are going to threaten their businesses. But many of them also concede that they are very early stage. Somewhere in 1 to 3 is 78% of the respondents are somewhere around 1 to 3. Maybe about 11% say that they are maturing in their perspective, somewhere between 7 and 10. And the rest, another 11%, somewhere between 4 and 6. So it's a recognition, and it's a concession by many of our organizations that digital is critical, but we're not there yet. And again, this precedes COVID. I think COVID has, as I've said earlier, accelerated the urgency to respond. And if you look at what has happened in education, for instance, for the past 10 years here at the university, we've talked about embracing more e-learning and online delivery. And over 10 years, the take-up has been perhaps 25 to 30%. In the space of 4 weeks, we have migrated all of our teaching delivery programs and in fact the administration of our exams online, so that adversity drives creativity and innovation. And I imagine it's the same thing that's happening in the business world in terms of in banking, in retail, organizations are being forced to make that transition. But let me offer a few suggestions. If we had the luxury of being strategic about it and planning for how we lead the organizational transition to being digital, there are a couple of things I would like to suggest. The first is to imagine a digital future. Imagine what your organization and your industry would look like, if things are completely digital. And then once you visualize that future, you work backwards. You work backwards to determine what are the things that I need to put in place to make sure that not only am I ready, but that I'm competitive in that imagined future. And again, perhaps, the luxury of using that sort of forecasting or foresighting and scenario planning has been disrupted by the fact that COVID is here, and it has forced us to think about that digital future. The second thing I would suggest is that the leadership of that digital transformational trajectory, again, has to be activist and visible at the very top of the organization. This third thing that you have to think about is, how do I now architect my digital ecosystems, both within the organization as well as how I connect externally with my customers and my partners, whether it's my supply chain partners or other kinds of collaborative partners, to exercise this new digital business models. The fourth thing is to expand the role of mobile and mobility. We've got to stop thinking of the mobile phone as just a device, but think of it as an enabler of mobility. That's quite important. And the fifth is try to embrace ways of combining the physical with the digital world, so that, again, in education, we think of blended learning, how we combine the digital space and the use of learning management systems and digital toolkits with what happens in the physical space, which is a traditional classroom. Well, I think in organizations we have to think as well about creative ways of combining the physical with the digital. And an example of that in a retail space, for instance, is what we call augmented reality. So that someone is walking past your storefront and a message pops up and says, "We have a special," and prompts them to walk into the store and act on impulse. So those are quite important, a series of important steps that I would suggest. But here's the thing. The most important thing to think about is that while the technology is critical to digital transformation, perhaps more important is an integrated approach within our business, within our strategic planning, so that digital transformation has to be a part of our business strategy. It has to be an integral attribute of the way we strategize our business and our business models. It shouldn't be that we plan business strategy and then we try and figure out how to enable that with digital. It has to be an integral part of that planning, so that digital in and of itself can create new business model opportunities. The second key thing and the second key pillar on which this stands is culture, and which is why this becomes an organizational leadership imperative, right? We have to actively encourage a mindset and a culture in both our management and rank and file that embraces flexibility, which comes from being digital, that embraces experimentation and the willingness to iterate in the way we innovate, right? And be prepared to make mistakes. The whole lean startup mantra of fail fast and fail early. The third thing, and we've spoken about this, is to establish the digital capabilities, the technology platforms that we've spoken about. So embracing cloud and mobile and big data analytics and AI. Those are all critical enablers. And the fourth thing is to ensure that we secure and develop digital talent. And this may be as a result of upskilling our current employees or ensuring that our recruiting practices identify and embrace and attract digital natives. But we have to create a workplace that encourages and enhances digital experiences, learning, knowledge sharing, and is flexible in terms of location and time. So again, those are just some of the pillars on which, as leaders, once we embrace the imperative for digital transformation, those are some of the pillars on which our digital transformational agenda has to sit. I end with a quote from perhaps my favorite scientist, Albert Einstein. The measure of intelligence is in the ability to change. And so digital transformation, the agility that comes from it, and the adaptability that it gives organizations, the flexibility, is a critical part of the kind of resilience that we have to build in our organizations and our industries, not only to respond to threats like pandemic threats like COVID-19, but any future uncertainties, disruptive challenges that will confront our organizations, and to put ourselves in a position to be able to capitalize on those adversities and perhaps turn them into opportunities. So, thank you for giving me the opportunity to make some remarks. I look forward to any kind of interactive discussions that we can have around these issues.